Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining our ABA Young Lawyers Division webinar on the future of policing, ending police violence, and the issue of qualified immunity. My name is Andrew Hairston, and I am going to be a co-moderator of this discussion today. I also like to allow my co-moderator, Lauren Barnes, to introduce herself. Everyone.
I am Lauren Barnes.
Great. So in this moment of culminating the end of the summer of 2020, we find ourselves thinking about a revolutionary set of 3 months, especially since the police murder of George Floyd on Memorial Day. As a nation, we have seen the largest collective social movement in our nation's history, quite arguably. And we wanted to bring together a panel of experts to talk about, given their expertise and their understanding of this area of the law, what these protests mean for us as we think about not only George Floyd, but Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, and other victims of police violence, but also how we as young lawyers and advocates can help move the needle on these issues and bring about some long needed change in this area. So I'd like to introduce our 3 extraordinary panelists today. First, we have Paul Henderson. Paul Henderson is a nationally recognized speaker, veteran prosecutor, and champion for social justice. Henderson has spent his entire professional career working in public service for the city of San Francisco, and most recently was appointed director of the Department of Police Accountability, where he and his legal team are tasked with investigating all complaints regarding police use of force and misconduct. The prestigious Office of San Francisco Civilian Oversight represents award-winning practices of police reforms defined by 21st century policing models. Prior to this appointment, Henderson spent 7 years as the Deputy Chief of Staff and Public Safety Director to the former mayor of the city of San Francisco, Edwin M. Lee. As a principal advisor to the mayor, he was responsible for the development and implementation of strategic policy and administration on major issues affecting the city with an emphasis on the criminal justice system. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Henderson.
Pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. We have Melba Pearson. Melba Pearson is an attorney specializing in civil rights and criminal law with an emphasis on policy. Before launching her consulting firm, MVP Law, she spent 3 years as deputy director of the ACLU of Florida, where she worked to change police practices, expand voting rights through Amendment 4, and reform the criminal justice system. Previously, Ms. Pearson was an assistant state attorney in Miami-Dade County for 16 years, culminating as assistant chief in the career criminal robbery unit, supervising junior attorneys while prosecuting homicide. She lives in Miami Beach with her husband, Bill. Thank you for joining us, Ms. Pearson.
Happy to be here.
And last but certainly not least, we have Christopher Bruce. Christopher Bruce Esquire is the political director for the ACLU of Georgia. Bruce has been a leader in the fight for civil rights and liberties across the state and country. He led a campaign against suppressing the Black vote in South Atlanta by preventing the closure of polling locations in majority Black districts during the 2016 mayoral election. In his first year as a lobbyist with the ACLU of Georgia, Bruce defeated a bill which added sentencing enhancements purposefully targeting Black Lives Matter protesters. In the same year, he had led a coalition to defeat legislation that would have labeled protesters as domestic terrorists. Bruce has also led a coalition of civil rights leaders and organizations that defeated legislation which would have jeopardized early voting hours and eliminated Sunday voting or Souls to the Polls programs. Such an honor to have you with us, Mr. Bruce.
Happy to be here with this distinguished panel.
So as you can see through their biographies, our panelists have an extensive history working for civil rights and liberties and really talking about these issues that we will discuss today. And we are just very thankful for their attendance. So we'll kick off the discussion. Mr. Bruce, can you provide us and the audience with some context and tell us about the history of policing in America?
Well, I'm glad we're starting there because maybe that will bring to light and shed some light on how this is actually happening. So I want to start off with one of my favorite quotes, which is, "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house." And the reason why I start that off is because we know that in the early 1600s, police forces looked nothing like what they do today. So they were mainly not night watch groups that were very informal in structure, of folks who volunteered to help stop vices such as prostitution and gambling at that time. Then, as cities and communities grew, the policing structure also grew and changed. But the structure that mostly closely resembles what we have today started really in the early 1700s. So the modern day policing structure we have is evolved like, as we know, most racist structures do, especially in the American South. So the first US city police department that's on record happened in 1704. And by no surprise, it was actually a slave patrol that was set up in the Carolinas. Their sole task was to capture runaway slaves and to stop slaves from revolting or running away again. After the Civil War ended, local sheriffs, locally elected sheriffs, began taking on the task of using their enforcement powers to do other things to maintain segregation and racist institutions. And then over time, modern police forces have continued to hold on to their origins by directing oppression and other things such as violence against Black people to enforce Jim Crow laws, wage the war on drugs, and again, the crackdown on what we see right now, which are protests. So it's very vital for any conversation about policing and police reform to actually start with the context of what system was created in the first place, and that is still happening today towards the oppression of Black people. So again, from their inception, police have always been tasked with protecting power and privilege at the expense of Black people. So I started my saying, and I'll end it with this: the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house.
I really appreciate that grounding. It's very helpful for us, Mr. Bruce. Ms. Pearson, so you worked as an assistant state attorney and likely have seen the funding structures from federal, state, and local revenue streams to local police departments. Could you talk about some of those funding structures that you may have witnessed, and if you think the funding levels are justified as they currently stand?
Sure, certainly. So as a prosecutor, and I'll make this very clear, many times when you are an assistant state attorney or a line prosecutor, as the term is often used, you don't get to see the bigger picture. I only started to understand the bigger picture of funding and how all of these things came about when I joined as deputy director of the ACLU of Florida. And that is, in my estimation, something that's intentional, because the more people that are kept in the dark, the less questions that can be asked, and you'll have less people with that ability to really challenge these structures. That's why transparency is so important. So when we talk about how to move forward as a society, we see Kim Fox in Chicago working towards a lot of transparency work, as well as a lot of other offices around the country. So getting back to the actual essential point of funding. Funding usually comes for police departments from county entities. So usually it's your county commission, your city council. Those are the folks who actually have a say in how police departments are funded. Using Miami as an example, because we're having a lot of activism around this issue right now, the county commission, the Miami-Dade County Commission, is currently voting on the budget for the 2021 fiscal year. And they have set aside $781 million for police. $781 million, which is within striking distance of $1 billion, right? And you think about the volume of that money, and that's going to include new helicopters, new surveillance equipment, all of these types of things. So you had so many local activists and different groups organizing and trying to speak out at the hearing saying, this is not what the people want. That $781 million represents 45% of the total budget for the fiscal year 2021 for Miami-Dade County. So if you think about just how some of those funds could be reallocated towards crime prevention, so that for me, it's about less victim survivors and then resulting in needing less police because we have safer communities, right? For me, it's about that, taking that holistic approach, which often gets left out of the discussion. And I'm going to end on this point. When I was a prosecutor, the one thing that I witnessed over and over again is whenever different, whether it be the governor, working with the legislature to set the statewide budget, which then comes down to the counties, which then gets reallocated, what ends up happening is when we're having a tough fiscal situation, as we're starting to face again coming up now as a result of COVID, but thinking about the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, all of the great community programs end up losing funding as a result of budget cuts. But then what happens is that when the communities are flush with money again, they're not replacing that money back towards the different groups that could work with survivors, again, crime prevention, working with youth, looking at some of those community-based restorative tactics. The funding gets taken away from these programs, the programs collapse, and then when it comes time to now look at the budget again, who ends up getting the money? It goes to the police because, our communities aren't safe. Well, if we had been funding these things all along, and if we restore funding when we have to cut it because of being, fiscally responsible, we wouldn't be in the situation that we are right now.
I really appreciate that perspective, right? To think about $1 billion, nearly $1 billion from Miami-Dade area for policing is just astounding. Mr. Henderson, I'd like you to reflect on your experience as a city official on this conversation, right, about funding police departments, about that local legislative process and other streams of revenue that might come up for funding police departments.
Yeah, it's kind of obscure and it's unclear. It's sort of an esoteric journey to try and figure out what the funding is and where it comes from. And it's a fascinating area in and of itself. And I would say my experience, both from being initially a prosecutor and then moving to an administrative role within management for the city, has really shined a light a lot on what that process is. But most of the information from me has been informed from transitioning, where I actually sit on the police commission. And so I see the budgets and I see where the money comes in and where and how it gets spent and where it gets allocated from the various sources. And so while you are having, typically what I see happening are people having an argument about an individual stream of income while ignoring that there are all of these other streams all flowing into the same organization or into the same work and effort. And so that's, the more informed we are, the better we can react, respond, and be accountable for our own funds. With that as an introduction, money comes into law enforcement agencies from a variety of sources, from the federal government, from state governments, from local governments, and from private entities. And all four are direct pipelines into any individual law enforcement agency. That doesn't mean that they all have all four, but it is not untypical for an agency, especially in larger cities, to have all four streams. Now, the interesting thing I think to look at and focus on is the funding stream from the federal government that's supplementing local action, that supplements local accountability for law enforcement agencies by having directives and money coming from a national level. And that money is pretty significant. This year, I think the budget was $400 million in 2020 that's allocated for various law enforcement agencies. And we've seen an increase in the federal funding since 1977, the end of the 70s. And around the crime bill, when the crime bill got passed, because the funding from a national level to support law enforcement and policing has increased over 200%. And so what that means is that money is coming in typically to expand law enforcement practices, but in some really insidious and creative ways, I think, that affect budgets, where money is given to agencies to construct new projects for new buildings, for equipment like cop cars. And a lot of that money is not hidden, but it seems obscure because they come through agricultural bills or grants that aren't typically traced through the Department of Justice. And so you're getting funding sources that are hard to trace or hard to presume where the money is coming from because it's coming from random departments at a federal level into the departments. The thing that I think we should be talking about, though, as we start talking about these funding sources is what is the effect of these federal dollars in fill in the blank city? And the thing that I think that it raises is when this money is being sent to supplement law enforcement or policing, how does that money undermine local authority? Or how does it undermine local control if individual cities feel a certain way and want policing to look a certain way? They lose some of those aspects because they don't control all of the budgets. And so even cutting or shifting those budgets means that those budgets from the law enforcement agencies are supplemented from federal sources. The thing that stands out to me in many of these federal programs is that there is no demand for compliance with many of these dollars, nor is there any duty to have data recording or any transparency on any of the behaviors. And this shifts us into some of the criticism that we've been seeing in growing waves, talking about the militarization of police departments in various cities. How are they getting this military equipment? But more importantly, how are they using that military equipment? And how is that process occurring without any standards, without any measures, without any accountability from what are you going to do with a tank? Is there an obligation for you to use the tank? And if there is, and if you do feel some pressure to use that tank, where is that tank more likely to be used and against whom? Which raises all of the other issues that I think we're going to get into about use of force and race disparities. But we have to look at the pipeline. And this is always, from my perspective, the beginning of the money. Follow the money. Where is the money? What is the source? Where are those assets coming from? What is the intent behind those assets? And that's why I think it's great that we're having this clear conversation about where the money is coming from. And I don't want to give short shrift to the other money sources. I just want to point out the elephant in the room about the money coming from the federal governments into local communities that undermines the control that those local communities may think that they have over controlling budgets. And I know we're going to shift to the defund the polices, but I just want to give context about this money before we get into that. The other areas that law enforcement are funded by are at a state level for various programs. While working as a prosecutor, many of those funding sources supplement any variety of policing in any city. And that's before we start talking about the funding that comes at a local level for policing. And in most cities, in most big cities, the police department and policing is their largest singular budget ticket item. So that means in almost every city that you go to, the largest check that they spend in a city is for their policing. And so that's part of why at this moment in time, when we talk about this whole movement of defund the police, and I know we're going to get into it, it seems really important that we look and know what those funding sources are in any particular city so that we know what money is being spent and where that money is going. And again, I don't want to ignore the fact that there are individual contributions and private contributions that also supplement and go into policing as well. In many cases, in my city, those contributions and grants have to be approved by the police commission, but in other cities, I know that those grants and dollars can be approved by their board of supervisors or their city council. And oftentimes those can be executive decisions made by the mayor's office or budget departments for specific cities and counties as well. But I don't want to ignore the fact that private individuals and private agencies also supplement and pour money into police departments. So when we are talking about controlling a budget, when we're talking about directing money, defining law enforcement in new ways, we really have to look at it from an approach of the sources of income so that we know it's not enough to say that we are going to control for example, a city budget. You still have to contemplate what is the state budget supporting and paying for? What are the federal budgets supporting and paying for? What are private dollars supporting and paying for that's independent of the control that we think we may have or the influence that we think we may have in terms of what our local budget may be, because that is not the entire pie of budgeting. So that's policing budget in a nutshell. There you go.
I absolutely love it. The comprehensiveness of it and the grounding. I may not have mentioned, I am the director of the Education Justice Project at a public interest justice center called Texas Appleseed in Austin. And a lot of my career has been focused on dismantling the school to prison pipeline. And so I appreciate you, Mr. Henderson, on grounding us in that bipartisan increase in policing money from the federal government from the 70s to our present day 2020, right? And not only has that been present in communities, but in my research in schools, in these highly militarized environments that young people attend from day to day. So I do want to segue into that conversation around defund the police that has just reached a groundswell this summer and continues to have a great deal of life. I think Ms. Pearson grounded us pretty well in some potential alternatives to policing funding. What could those dollars go to instead of policing? But I wanted to open it up to our panelists. What have you heard in your advocacy communities? What have you heard on the ground of things that communities want to be funded instead of policing?
Well, I'll just say, because I think you raised a really good point in talking about education, one of the things that I would just throw out in context is that most other agencies aren't funded in the same way. And so education is one of the great examples that I use just by comparison when we talk about law enforcement and law enforcement budgets, is you don't have, in some cities, education is not a line item that the local government pays for. It's an independent expenditure that the school districts operate on their own, which there's not a right or wrong answer, but I just like to show what the differences have been. And when we start approaching this issue of defund the police, right? And that means a variety of things to a variety of individuals and a variety of agencies, because that's really important too. And on both sides of the coin, you hear arguments that summarize their interpretation of what defund the police can mean for them. But let me just qualify it from my perspective. And, we want to hear from the other panelists as well. But from my perspective, in looking at what defund the police means, we have to look at the history, especially in just where we have been in 2020, where we have seen with COVID, we've all been at home. We've all been watching transgressions in our videos and in the news again and again of issues occurring involving outcomes related to law enforcement behavior and Black and brown communities that have been shocking for a lot of people on webcams, on private cameras, but definitely in the news. And that is happening, those observations are occurring while we are coming up into a budget cycle or the end of a budget cycle. And it's raising the question of priorities for the individual cities. We are now in a recession in this nation. And so it's a valid and a fair question to ask where our tax dollars are going and what are we supplementing or what are we paying for in light of COVID, in light of cutbacks, in light of the number of dollars that are flowing into our city programs are shrinking. And again, as a reminder, for most jurisdictions, law enforcement is their singular highest ticket expense in a city. And it is a fair observation for communities to say, I want to be accountable for my tax dollars and know and understand what I'm paying for and where it's going. And what we are not willing to do, especially in Black and brown communities, is write a check for race disparate outcomes and continue a perpetuation in systems and taxes and dollars and municipal approaches that we don't support. I think those are fair questions. Now, the answers vary all across the country, but it's a fair question to be able to ask and challenge and ask our municipalities what our dollars are going towards and what are we getting for those tax dollars. And so, I oftentimes get frustrated when I am with groups or audiences that feel like it's defund the police, and that means that there will be no policing on the streets. Everybody, let's just be clear. Everybody wants to be safe. Everyone wants to live in safety. Black and brown communities want to live in safety. There, I've said that, tweet that. But that means that we all have a say-so at the table. We all have a voice. We are all communities that exist here in the United States and in our cities, and we all are entitled to have a say-so. We're all entitled to say what those public safety interpretations and definitions should look like. And that does not mean automatically that there will be no policing anywhere, that there will be no law enforcement. And I know that's where we're about to go, but that's my approach to defund the police. And that's the approach to understanding what the issue is. And that's the interpretation that gives context to the right for us to say as communities and as individuals that as much as we define what we want law enforcement and policing to look like, we also have the right to say what we don't want it to look like, what we don't want it to include, what we don't want to have happen. And to the degree that speaks to race disparities in policing, to the degree it speaks to race disparities in law enforcement, to the degree it speaks to sustaining race disparities in our funding priorities and objectives, that's the issue. So that's the approach for me. Okay, just want to, I know I get on a roll and.
Let's go.
Okay.
Paul is on a roll there.
Sorry, I got
But it's
I got a lot
good
to say.
information.
It's good.
Good information.
It's good. It's good. And it was good information. And just really putting it more in context of what happens, especially in Georgia, because that's what I know about. Georgia spends $4.8 billion annually on police and corrections. And much of that work is really based off of what happens in daily harassment of people, especially people of color in certain communities. So if you really consider this, out of the 10.3 million arrests that are made per year, only 5% of those are for the most serious offenses, which include murder, rape, and aggravated assault, which really comes down to what? The other 95% of those things are for traffic violations, marijuana arrests, unlawful assembly, and even allegedly using counterfeit $20 bills like we saw with George Floyd. So when you talk about divesting in the policing, we could reinvest in other vital resources that helps the community thrive. So to divest is to shrink and misuse police power along with their budgets and to ensure that they just don't come up with unnecessary contact with community members. So divestment in policing and reinvesting in the community can really include having emergency responders who are not police officers and emergency responders with expertise to handle mental health issues or services that may arise. Having more school counselors, social workers, nurses for schools, youth programming, job training. I mean, it keeps going on. Infrastructure projects that increase and improve transit access. And of course, anytime when we talk about divesting in police, we wonder, you know, like was said before, what happens if we stop spending so much money in policing? What will this look like if less police are on patrols? But let's be clear, less policing is already happening in our society. They're only happening in certain communities that really don't look like communities of color, okay? So if you go into white communities, they don't always have a huge police presence. In contrast, you see Black communities which are constantly over-policed and plagued by racialized policing, because really that's what the institution was set up for, what I was talking about before, when we know that policing comes from slave patrols in the first place. So one example of this is, again, looking at marijuana arrests. And I know everybody on this panel knows about this. Black people and white people use marijuana at the same rates, but we all know Black people are arrested for marijuana possession at a rate almost 4 times that higher than whites. So policing is not the solution towards societal problems. So divestment is nothing scary when it comes to this. We are really looking at solving the problems which happen in our communities every day.
And to piggyback on what both Paul and Chris were saying, I think the underlying message that is getting out there among certain communities is that of fear. So it's all about this fear mongering of there's these, crazy people that want to make sure there's no police anywhere. So when you call 911, press 1 if you're being murdered, press 2 if you're being sexually assaulted, and leave a message. And at some point, someone to get back to you, right? And that's not at all what this discussion is about or the intention would be. I think there's also some fear amongst police officers that, oh my gosh, if they truly defund the police, we're all going to lose our jobs overnight, and how are we going to feed our families, right? So with that self-preservation sort of mindset, then the discussion around reimagining the criminal justice system often gets stuck. So I think we need to kind of get off of the fear aspect and really look at the facts and look at what we're asking for. What communities of color are asking for is policing similar to that of white communities. And not just policing, we have to zoom out into the bigger picture and look at the fact that certain schools are being funded on a better level because of the use of property taxes, right? So now certain schools have, state-of-the-art laptops and computer labs and after school programming and all these things that keeps kids off the streets, kids safe, right? And then, you look at, just how juvenile justice is handled. If a kid gets in trouble, is it about taking the kid back to their family and being like, okay, mom and dad, you know what time it is, you need to handle this? Or do you immediately take the child to your, juvenile jail and then send them on the school to prison pipeline? Are there other programs if someone doesn't have access to healthcare and they're having a mental health episode or they're struggling with addiction? If they can't afford to go to Betty Ford, is there another option for them, right? So it's about creating those services that people can use to better their lives rather than immediately criminalizing certain activities, because in white and more resource communities, that's what happens, right? It's more of that collaborative approach where the community sits down and lays out what their concerns are. And then in collaboration with the police, with the city government, a vision is created that is consistent with what that community wants. In the Black community, that's not what happens. It's more of a parental approach, a paternalistic approach, where it's coming in and we're going to tell you what you need to be safe. And people are like, but we don't feel safe under this model. When you look at the concept of community policing, and I'll leave it there after this, when we talk about community policing, white communities have had community policing from the beginning of time, right? Because you have the police officers that live in the community that are the next door neighbors to the people that they are tasked with protecting and serving. They know that Johnny down the street is a promising athlete, but likes to party too much on the weekends. They know that, Mary tries to take care of her grandmother with Alzheimer's, and sometimes they struggle to make ends meet, right? So they're embedded in the community, and they don't view the community as other. They don't view themselves as an occupying force. These are our neighbors and we have to protect them. So we need to see a similar approach taken to communities of color. And some of that is going to involve reinvestment of resources.
And can we just tie that, I'm sorry to jump in, but that I agree with that wholeheartedly. But just to remind the audience that we aren't talking about aspirational objectives that aren't based on real disparities. And so what is at the base and the foundation of all of this are real racial disparities tied to actual policing and law enforcement. And if we take a step back from that and we look at the entire justice system that is, these are new demands for reform all the way around. And right now and today we're talking about policing, but the whole spectrum is tied to disparities associated with race. And we have real numbers behind what is wrong with these systems. If we were able to correlate Black and brown communities being incarcerated as the same rate as white majority, our entire prison system would be reduced by 40%. 40%. And here's the thing, you don't have to like my opinion, but you don't get to argue with my facts. So I like statistics. They make me really happy. And I like to talk about the incarceration for Black and brown communities that is 10 times the national rate. I like to talk about use of force disparities, which is 19.3 times for Black and brown communities in policing throughout this country. I mean, these are real facts. These are real numbers. These are real issues. And these are the demands that I think are being made for conversations that have been taking place for justice that are now evolving beyond justice now into let me examine your budgets. Let me examine how you're doing policing. Let me examine the transparency in terms of who you stop, how you stop, what are your hit rates, what are your charging rates, what are your sentencing rates. And it's the full spectrum, but it begins many times with policing and law enforcement, which is why we're having these conversations. But I just wanted to tie it up and make sure that we're not forgetting that there are still needs and disparities in charging. There are still needs and disparities in sentencing. There are still needs and disparities in our entire prison system. And that's a whole nother conversation, but that is a really good one in talking about the privatization of jails and prisons that we have in this country and how they are funded and what their needs are and the pipelines that are fed to them from cities throughout this country as well. Now back to policing. So in terms of the work that we need to do there, I think, again, that it's just a fair question for us to say what we're doing with the money, and not a small amount of money in each of the cities. And this is why we're having many of these conversations right now and on panels like this, where the more informed we are, the better decisions we can make. And oftentimes, I think people feel like they're overwhelmed and they don't know where the money comes from. They don't know where the money is going. They know that they pay their taxes, but they aren't aware that the largest ticket item in their city is law enforcement. And because it is, that they should have questions about, and they should want to know the answers about what that means. How are these just adoptive admissions for their dollars that are funding and paying for public safety definitions that they haven't had their voices heard on? And I'm specifically talking about Black and Brown communities, so that it's a more inclusive conversation for all of the vulnerable communities to have a seat at the table, because you know what? Their dollars are at the table. They built the table. And so the more broad that we can make that table, the more broad that we can have an inclusionary conversation about what policing looks like, what public safety looks like, and what government looks like, I think we have a better society at the end of the day. And so all of that is what's behind, from my perspective, what defund the police means. And I think it's an interpretive response and an interpretive approach that we all need to take. And the more informed we are, the more conversations like this that we have, the better we can approach having and sharing our opinion to improve everyone's lives and safety. So I don't remember what the question was, but I had something to say. So
That's great. Thanks all three of you for your
Good
reflection.
information.
All of them were spot on, every answer. So, before we move on to another topic on qualified immunity, I want to ask one more question about the summer and its fairly revolutionary events. Soon after George Floyd was murdered, the Minneapolis City Council voted to disband its police department. And then in Austin, where I live, the city council voted a couple of weeks ago to defund the Austin Police Department by about $150 million over the next 3 years, about $20 million immediately through a hiring freeze. And I think actions such as that in communities like Austin and Minneapolis have fueled this movement this summer. So I wanted to just get folks' reactions to those types of legislative movements and actions, and see what folks are hearing in their communities and how we can continue to capitalize on this momentum.
Well, I mean, I think a multi-pronged approach here, because as I mentioned before, in Miami, we're having budget hearings with the county commission and people are letting their voices be heard. But the flip side of it is that it's kind of falling on deaf ears. So a lot of the county commissioners are like, saying things like, oh, you guys seem coached. You guys don't really understand what you're asking for. And just, being very dismissive of the calls and concerns around the overall budget and how much is going towards police enforcement, and looking at social services in comparison and how little is going towards social services. I believe it was well, then Senator Joe Biden made a comment years ago that show me your budget and I'll tell you what your priorities are. So if 45% of your budget in Miami is going towards police, then that's your priority. Your priority is not homelessness, people experiencing homelessness. Your priority is not addressing addiction. Your priority is, feeding that particular machine. So the one thing I definitely want to caution everyone is as we engage in these discussions, we also have to hold the people with the power accountable. Because again, in Miami, and I'm sure as in with the rest of the country, excluding the federal races, because I'm not talking about presidential, I'm talking locally, folks are getting ready to vote in November. And if you haven't paid attention to anything below the top of the ticket, you could be voting for more of the same. You could be voting for your own oppression. Because again, if you have people who are in positions of power and they dismiss the calls of the community and they're not willing, as we see in majority communities, to sit down at the table with impacted communities and create a vision that works for everyone, that involves compromise, then we're never going to be able to move forward. So I just caution everyone as we embark on reimagining what the criminal justice system looks like, to make sure that the people who have the power are truly aligned with your values. And if they're not, you need to vote accordingly, because that is going to be one of the biggest blockades in being able to see the change that we seek.
Andrew, why don't we talk about what you were talking about in Austin as well? So what Melba's going towards, these things are happening. So Austin's police department has a budget of $435 million, and when you're saying they're going to cut $150 million, it's a great step towards meaningful police reform. And this is where it comes down again to what Melba was saying. Their Austin City Council plans to defund a reimagined public safety program to what our elected officials, what we really need to do all across the country. They need to reimagine a more effective and limited role for police to ensure public safety and the reality of things. So, and I want to take an example of what happened in the city of Atlanta a while ago. Rayshard Brooks was gunned down by the police. And it really goes towards law enforcement versus public safety. So in law enforcement, if you have an individual, you said was asleep behind the wheel at a Wendy's, you call out the police do a DUI test, or what they consider to be a DUI test. And the individual saying, hey, I can call up my cousin, I can call up a friend to take me home. Just let me get home. And they say, no, we're going to arrest you. A scuffle ensues, and then that individual, while running off, gets shot and he dies. He's dead, and those two police officers are now currently on charges. Compared to something that you can have with public safety, and this is where I think it's important for people to imagine. You still have an individual who's asleep at a Wendy's. Someone gets called out, and they go ahead and they assess the situation of, first, sir, we don't know if you are under the influence or not, but we do know that you stopped and you pulled over, and now you're not a danger to anyone else on the road. That's number one. Number two, yes, is there someone that can pick you up and take you home? Can we call you a lift? Can we take you home so you can get back to your wife and your family, and we can get back to helping out and making sure that other people are safe in their communities? That's reimagining the police. It's making sure that people make it home safely. We can talk about a fine or anything else when it comes to prosecution later on, but really what the police need to do as far as protecting the people in the public, that should be their foremost thought, instead of harassing and terrorizing others.
Yeah, I would say, too, just in talking about this, the options, the examples that you've given, both Austin and in Minneapolis, again, I just like to clarify the misperceptions that I hear about on both sides of the fence, misinterpreting what they believe defund the police can be and should be. But to stress the points, but to make a different ones that both Melba and Chris made, this is oftentimes a smart approach when we contemplate that throughout this country and throughout this nation, we're using policing to address social ills and reforms that may not be the best use of our resources. And I'm specifically talking about social ills like homelessness, social ills like mental health, social ills like substance abuse. Now, whether you have an opinion or not about any of those things, or even just poverty, and whether you have an opinion or not about any of those four things, the reality is in most cities, the police department is the agency that we have responding to many of those issues as they occur in society. And part of what I think Defund the Police can be is an analysis on whether or not that is the best use of our resources to address issues like that with law enforcement approaches. And that doesn't mean that they can't touch upon each other at some point in time when behavior rises to the level of public safety, but we have to have clear conversations and we have to have a clear approach and decisions being made about whether or not this is what the expectation is and how do we justify that approach and that response when we're aware of the disparities involving many of those issues that correlates with race. Because here's the thing, we don't get to have a conversation about socioeconomics without talking about race, because they're so closely correlated. But if it makes people feel more comfortable, we can shift it and just talk about socioeconomics because the numbers are still the same. The communities are still the same. The results are still the same. And so that part of what we're having conversations about when we talk about cutting these budgets is it's not just that we are going to take money away from a law enforcement agency. It's that we are going to shift our dollars. We're going to shift resources to focus on homelessness in a new way, to focus on mental health in a new way, to focus on substance abuse in a new way, to focus on quality of life crimes in a new way that are reflections of poverty and socioeconomics. And in this moment in time, in this country, in a recession, while we're in COVID, I think it's a perfect time for us to be having these deep and meaningful conversations about what our budgets do look like, what our city's priorities are, and what our individual priorities are. That's why, I think voting is so important. And the more informed we are, the more direct access we have to making the kind of changes that we want. We can't take a precatory approach to change. It has to move beyond, we wish things could be better. I wish that didn't happen. I hope that something changes. We have to inform ourselves and be a part of that change. And the first step towards making those kinds of changes is being informed as to what's going on and being informed as to what the issues are. And so that's why I think conversations like this are really important about defund the police. Educate yourself and know and understand what's possible, and know and educate yourselves initially so that you know and understand what's actually going on in your city. What is your budget for law enforcement? What does that cover? Are there disparities that you care about in your country that are in your city going on right now that you could be doing more about? But you can't fix what you don't talk about. And so we have to have these conversations and learn what's happening in our own backyard so that we can come to that table and express our voice. And I think that that's really important because that's what we're doing and what we're all a part of today and right now. So again, I don't remember what the question was. I just had something to say. So
I want to actually jump in with one point. So as we're reimagining what public safety can look like, here are some examples for folks to kind of get their mind around it, right? So for instance, there is a project called the Cahoots project out of Eugene, Oregon. And it's fairly new, a couple years old, but they're seeing really positive outcomes where it's the type of situation where instead of calling 911, you call this other number when you have, certain enumerated issues. Yeah. So again, looking at mental health, looking at substance abuse, things like that, not, like an active homicide. That's not the number you would call, right? So you'd call the Cahoots program and then they would send experts to come out and respond to the particular issue. So if it's somebody having a mental health, break, then obviously you would bring out somebody who's a social worker or somebody who's a nurse and try to connect folks with the services they need so that we don't have a situation, because I'll throw out one statistic, 25% of the police encounters that turn violent tend to be linked to mental health. So if a quarter of violent interactions are as a result of mental health, then maybe we should be finding different ways to deal with mental health issues so that you won't have that violent outcome, right? If we look abroad in I believe it's either Norway or Sweden, they have mental health ambulances. So if somebody is having a mental health situation, an ambulance responds, and in that ambulance is like a social worker, a nurse, and an orderly to be able to either A, give the person medication on the scene, or B, transport them to a mental health facility. Because again, at the end of the day, who do you want somebody responding to a mental health issue? And this is no offense to the police officers who do, work and do their best every single day, but many of them went to academy for 6 months. You get a couple hours of training on mental health, unless you're in an elite team, some of which are, occur across the country, but that's not the majority. So you've had a little bit of interaction with regards to mental health, and now you're being thrown into a very tense situation, trying to respond appropriately, as opposed to somebody who has a master's in social work, who spent 4 years of college, 2 to 4 years, in the master's program, plus residency, plus clinical work, working on these issues, solely working on mental health, who is in a better position to respond? So that's the type of thought process that we really want to encourage people to explore as we talk about reallocation of resources and reimagining the public safety, what public safety looks like.
I'm going to kick it over to Lauren.
I want to discuss the topic of qualified immunity. It's been a very controversial topic lately, especially with the killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and even the recent shooting of Jacob Blake. I want to direct this question to Mr. Henderson. Can you please give us a background on qualified immunity and why it is so important when it comes to police reform?
Sure, that's a big question. So that's okay. I'm ready for you, girl.
Thank you.
All right. So that is a big question, and qualified immunity is looming large as we're talking about justice reforms generally now and specifically, especially at the national level. And I'll get to that. But first, let me start off just by explaining generally that qualified immunity is a judicially created doctrine, and it shields officials and law enforcement agents from being personally liable for constitutional violations. And that means things that like excessive force can be protected. And I would say the seminal case for those lawyers out there that like to do a little bit of research and know that it was created, the seminal case was in 1982, Harlow versus Fitzgerald, that defined this doctrine. I would say that there's been some big changes. In 1986, the Supreme Court ruled, and that was Malley versus Briggs, that expanded the definition of qualified immunity beyond just any reasonable or a reasonable officer to a reasonable officer. And that lowered, or it raised the standard for what you must pierce in order to have personal liability for bad behavior, is the way that I would qualify it, just for context of this conversation so that people understand. But the line that stood out to me from that case in particular, when I talk about qualified immunity, was the line in that case that said that it now provides ample protection to all but the plainly incompetent and those who knowingly violate the law. And that was the intent, to provide protections, because that is the standard, and that's a really low standard. And so when you hear about the frustrations or you see conversations challenging qualified immunity, that's what's behind it. It's also, just to tie it back into the conversation that we were having earlier, when we were talking about budgets, when we were talking about defund the police, when we're talking about money streams, we have a separate stream from individual cases that are resolved or settled that don't run to personal transgressions. Let me explain. When you have an officer or a law enforcement agent acting independently or acting in a way that is protected, even when it is a clear transgression for something like, let's say, excessive force, which, as a reminder, has 19.3% disparities across the board in this country for race disparities, that is protected. And those costs are oftentimes settled with, say, civil settlements, where you sue the individual who is protected. So you end up suing the department, you end up suing the city. And then those settlements are resolved through the local city attorney's offices. And those are independent expenses that are typically not counted against budget allocations. So what that means is you could have a whole pipeline of disparities that are coming forward and through our justice system that don't touch the individual, that don't touch the department, but are paid for from tax dollars. And so that's the big context when we start talking about qualified immunity of why this issue is so important. And I will say, before I turn it over to my other panelists, that part of the conversation that's going on right now in this nation is there are two reform packages and bills that are going through both houses. So there's a Republican version and there is a Democratic version, and they both speak to qualified immunity. There is a reduction in qualified immunity in the JIPA bill, that's the Democratic bill hosted by Kamala Harris and Cory Booker, that diminishes how people can sue and how people can hold those specific departments accountable, specifically when there are instances where a victim can show that there was brutality involved or violence used against them from law enforcement agency. That qualified immunity diminished standard is not in the Republican bill. And I think it's a really important factor separating the two in terms of analyzing which bill is going to be supported in this nation. I will also say that there are at least 10 cases that are in the pipeline for the Supreme Court to reinterpret and redefine what qualified immunity can look like. Two of those cases, there were 12, but I think two of them were just passed upon by the Supreme Court, but there are still some other opportunities for them to take up a case that is challenging qualified immunity that could result in a different interpretation. But until then, there are opportunities to address qualified immunity, like I said, at the federal level, but there are opportunities and conversations taking place at a state and local level as well. And so that's the approach to qualified immunity that we're talking about that I think is really important. And again, we can't fix what we don't understand and what we don't talk about. And so the conversations are really important for us to be understanding what the limitations are and how these laws and rules work in protecting sometimes bad behavior and what that means for communities and what it means for cities and what it means for budgets. That's my answer for what qualified immunity is. Okay. That's it.
Hey everyone, we recognize it's the top of the hour and the number of folks may have had to drop off. If our panelists are able and want to stay on for another 15 minutes or so, we can do that, but I understand if schedules don't permit.
I didn't even realize time was passing that fast. I was just doing the setup for qualified immunity, you know. I was just warming it up. Sorry, I feel like I talked to you.
I thought it was my computer.
Yeah. I think we
I'm
can
good to stay for another few if.
Okay.
Oh, man. This is a very important topic. So yeah, this is something we need to talk about.
Yeah, especially, okay. I was just going to say, especially because now there are two bills that are pending that are dealing with many of the things that we talked about in terms of justice reforms. And so understanding those in terms of who we are supporting and what we're supporting, I think is really, really important because there's such different approaches. Qualified immunity is bundled in there or it's omitted from those approaches, but there's some really important stuff in there that I think is relevant and timely right now. Things like the qualified and reformed use of force is supremely important. If you, as in most jurisdictions, if you don't have a reformed or revised use of force approach, that means, as in most jurisdictions in this country, that your use of force that is being allowed in your department is decades old and includes things that don't reflect best practices, like chokehold techniques, like shooting at cars, like no-knock warrants. These are all things that are adoptive admissions if your jurisdictions have not reformed your use of force priorities for your department. These are the questions that I think, you know, when I talk to a lay audience, that I say, when they ask me, like, what can I do in fill in the blank? Start here. You know what I mean? Like, follow the pipeline of where we know statistically race disparities are embedded and things like use of force, and ask, do we have a revised use of form process in this country or in this city or in this jurisdiction? Because if not, we have a subjective interpretation of use of force that ends up creating, defining, and perpetuating race disparities in terms of what policing is. And this is all part of the things that I think separate out the two approaches at a national level in the Republican bill and the Democratic bill, where many of those techniques are reduced but not eliminated, where they are studied but not banned, where they are ignored but not addressed. And use your own judgment about them, but these are the questions that you should be asking as you're analyzing legislation. These are the questions you should be asking as you're inquiring to your chief of police. These are the things that you need to be informed about as you come to create your seat at the table and ask about your budgetary processes in your city and county for your own tax dollars. And so I just think it's all supremely important. And the more we educate ourselves about what's going on, the better we can have a say or exercise our voice at our seat at the table to make a difference, to redefine and, you know, make changes around us that are going to create public safety for all communities. Because I think that ultimately is the goal. So.
And I think we also have to address the ability of police departments to remove bad actors, because many times as we get, and I know there was a question floating around out there about the protocols around use of force, you know, there's no standard universal protocol around use of force. Every department kind of defines it differently. And, you know, we've discovered as a result of George Floyd, some departments would ban the use of chokeholds, but they also have something like a cardial compression, which is basically a chokehold like this, right? Like, it's not like this, it's like this, but you're still putting compression on someone's, you know, neck area so that they're unable to breathe, right? So now more departments, now that that's come to light, more departments are removing that language and saying you can't engage in any kind of way that puts pressure on someone's airway as a part of being able to take someone into custody. But as we kind of explore these issues, again, in Florida, we're very unique because we have a law enforcement bill of rights, which makes it virtually close to impossible to remove bad actors in the police department. You know, we're having situations come to light where you'll have a police officer that'll have 16, 17 civilian complaints of brutality, yet still remain on the job because of the fact of the arbitration process, which makes it very difficult, as opposed to other jurisdictions in other states where, you know, the police chief has more autonomy in being able to remove bad actors. So that's something that I think everyone needs to become very educated about for their locality as to what the process is to remove bad actors. And if you find it's virtually impossible to do so, then that is something that you need to be putting pressure on your state representatives, your state senators, your you know, House of Delegates, you know, whatever form of government you have in your state, to be able to change these laws. Because again, when you have a situation where a department is unable to get rid of bad actors, then we just see a perpetuation of the same problem. And even as we explore ideas of reallocating resources, we'll still have people on the force that may be tied to white extremist groups or might be brutal in other ways for a variety of other reasons, and we're not able to address that as well.
You know what, Melba brings up a very good point that is actually going across this nation right now as far as reevaluating how we hold the police accountable. And we know that on a lot of, even on the state level, like the Bill of Rights that you have, this has been proposed in other states, have already been passed. And actually, in response to what's been happening over the summer or Black Lives Movement, they've actually increased. So we're actually giving more protections to the police at a time when we should be holding the police more accountable. And again, we want good police officers on the street. We want to make sure that the communities are at a safe and in a way that we can all get along together. So when it comes to police unions and the contracts that municipalities have in them, a popular thing may be if there is a shooting or something else happens, a police officer cannot be questioned within a certain amount of time. Or you can only question a police officer with only 2 people in the room. If a third person walks into the room, then the entire investigation gets thrown out. All of these protections that the police have that the average citizen doesn't have goes way beyond what is meaningful as far as holding the police accountable. So rolling back these changes, reimagining the role of the police, and making sure that they're being held accountable really leads to a better future for us all when it comes down to it. But the policies and procedures, when it comes down to things such as chokeholds, when it comes down to de-escalation, banning certain use of tactics, they're using tear gas. Tear gas is a chemical weapon that you can't even use in war, but they're using this on American civilians. So when you put that in perspective of us signing the Geneva Convention and saying, hey, there's certain things that we should not even expose people to, let's not shy away from it. If you're using chemical weapons on civilians, if you have armored vehicles on the streets, and you're giving the people who are using these weapons immunity from using them, I'm saying that is just fine for that to happen without any type of accountability. We're not living in a democracy, we're living in a police type of state. And again, I know a lot of people who serve on the force who do an amazing job of protecting the community. So it's not everyone, but there are some out there who do need to be held accountable. And so we shouldn't shy away from that. We should embrace it like we do in a democratic process.
Yeah, I would say I just want to end it talking a little bit about, I really like the specific examples to give people context so that they know what we're talking beyond our theoretical approaches to many of the things that we've all been talking about today with things like the Breonna Taylor situation and the no-knock warrants, because we already know as a nation among experts that no-knock warrants are a risk. And they are a risk not just to the person that is being served the warrant on, but to bystanders, witnesses, and to the force themselves, that officers are at risk. And yet, because we don't have a reformed use of force policy in some jurisdictions, we still have some agencies using no-knock warrants and creating risks. And so these are adoptive communities that could happen tomorrow in many of these jurisdictions because no-knock warrants are being subjectively applied. And this is before you even start analyzing who those subjective applications of no-knock warrants are being applied to with the race disparities and all of that. This is just and I use this as an example all the time so people know and give context to the conversation that things like this are just bad that we can fix with policies. Things like this are just bad that we can fix if we're informed. Things like no-knock warrants and neck restraint techniques, which should be banned, can be fixed if we know to ask for them to be banned. And the more we know, the better we can be as a society. And I think people get intimidated by a lot of these conversations and subject matters because they seem so esoteric, or they seem so legal, or they seem so enmeshed in law enforcement protections and public safety protections. And we can't distinguish or articulate a difference that if we say we don't want neck techniques like we saw with George Floyd, if we don't want no-knock warrants like we saw in Breonna Taylor, like that means that we don't or can't support police, or we don't or can't support law enforcement. And that's just the cognitive dissonance. That's not the reality. But we can't separate those types of issues if we're not informing ourselves. And it's easy to do by listening to panels and conversations like this. It's easy to do by finding thought leaders and figuring, let me just take a step by following this person on Twitter. Let me take a first step. Let me go listen to what Christopher Bruce has to say next week when he's giving a presentation. Let me follow him on Facebook and hear what he has to say about fill in the blank, so we can all start learning and educating ourselves about these really important topics, because we do have a voice, and we, beyond us, our individual voices and vote, that we have an opinion and we can educate ourselves as to what's going on. So I just want to, I know we're wrapping things up, but thank everybody for listening and paying attention and hearing this information and having this conversation, because I expect everybody that sat on here, that logged in, to leave and have these conversations. And sometimes these can be difficult conversations about what you've learned, what you've heard with your family, with your friends, with your peers, because we can't expect people to care more about our approaches to justice than we do. But if we don't articulate them, if we don't say them, if we don't share them, if we don't show them, then we do. So that's my closing. Thank you for being here, but let's all convert this into action. Let's all take away from this an agenda to do better, to reform, and to increase public safety for all communities. That's the goal. Again, there's no question, I was just talking. So
It's interesting that you said that, because that was going to be my next question on how can members of the ABA-YLD engage in this conversation in their communities.
Yeah, I think stuff like having, you could post something like this on your Facebook. You could put something that you learned here in your Instagram. You can have a conversation in at your lunchtime today and say, oh my gosh, I heard this woman talking to me about defund the police from Florida, and let me tell you what she said. You know what I mean? Like, there are little steps, but it all makes a difference, because otherwise, when people are silent on these issues, I think it's too easy for people not to know what to do or to inform themselves what to do. And it's okay to say that I don't know. It's okay to say that I want to get educated, but I'm not going to go and read that case that Paul Henderson was talking about from the Supreme Court in 1986 that expanded qualified immunity in this way. I get it, no, but there are easier ways to make your education process more palatable. And we have an obligation to find those pathways if we want change and if we want a difference. And I think the first step there is engaging in conversations or following other thought leaders that may have opinion that you agree or don't agree on, but you want to hear more of what they may have to say, because you are educating yourself so that you can educate others, because we do have an obligation to share our thoughts with our children who are going to be voting or are voting. We do have an obligation to share with our neighbors, and we have an obligation to share with vulnerable communities who want a seat at the table that may not even know what is going on or why society is structured in the way that it is, that don't know what the history of policing was until they heard from Christopher this morning, that didn't know how budgets operated at a local level until Melba explained it this afternoon. These are conversations, this is information that is crucial in informing our actions. This is information that is crucial in informing our votes. This is information that is crucial in defining public safety. And so all of this stuff matters, and people have 1,000 things to do. Everyone is busy. The fact that people logged in to learn from all of us or to hear our conversations, whether you agreed with them or not, moves the needle. It educates an audience and allows them to make different decisions for themselves and the communities that they care about. I know I'm on a roll and I don't remember what I was answering again, but
this is good. Thank you. This is good information. I love it.
But I definitely want to jump in one more thing and just remind people that all politics is local. All politics is local. So again, we have the presidential election coming up in November. That's incredibly important. But you're also going to have mayoral races on the ballot in November. You're going to have city council races and commission races on the ballot this November. So you have to get educated around what local powers have control over these types of budgets, who work on these issues. Follow the organizations locally that work on these issues, or at least just get to know them, right? Mm-hmm. Do a Google alert on, a certain issue for your local newspaper. So that way, when these things keep popping up, you may not have to, let's face it, right? Like, listen, I don't sit and read Miami Herald every morning. That's just my reality, right? But if I see a Google alert around a specific issue, around, okay, this is the second hearing with regards to civilian oversight of the police here in Miami-Dade County, well, I see that alert, I'm going to read that article because that's very relevant to my concerns and to things that are actionable at this point. So I just encourage folks to really dive in locally, because now you learn your local landscape, you can advocate for change locally, and that's what gets the ball rolling. Once you have more localities and cities and counties that we can point to that have successfully reimagined what public safety and community looks like, and what community engagement around the criminal justice system looks like, then more folks are going to be less threatened, because they're going to be like, oh, it worked in Camden, it worked in Austin, it worked in Minneapolis. All right, maybe this is something that we can try here. It gives more political cover. So that is how we build the momentum of change bit by bit. But it starts with us getting informed on the issues and being effective educators of ourselves, of our family and friends, and then putting the pressure on either at the ballot box or through public comment at some of these commission hearings and things like that, where we're letting our elected officials know what we care about and what our priorities are, and that we will not be ignored.
So if we're hearing exactly what Paul is saying, if we're hearing exactly what Melba's saying, if we're hearing this constantly of saying this is happening on the local level, then you need to get involved on the local level. And nobody's telling you that you have to completely change the police department by yourself. You don't. Because guess what? This is not the first time this conversation has ever been had. You probably already have a lot of groups in your community right now talking about this issue before the issue became popular. And that's what you really need to focus on. The people who are mostly impacted by this situation are the ones who have already been calling for change for decades, for years that have been going on. So this is something where you can easily join another group or start your own and say, we're going to make a difference. And again, by you just logging in on this situation right here, says you're making a step to further yourself. Well, take that next step. Find out who it is on your local level who can actually, who's adept in this issue. Find out from your elected official which one on your city council or your state rep or your state senator who actually really cares about when it comes to police reform or anything else. Because there is someone out there already in your community doing this type of work. You need to, again, become educated on this type of issue so you can better yourself. And then by you bettering yourself and educating yourself, you're really going to better educate your community and have things work better when it comes to police interactions. So really what I'm summing up here is, if you have any questions, just call Paul and he'll tell you exactly what to do. Because Paul likes stuff like that. And of course, make sure you follow Melba and everything that happens too. So that's what I had to put that in there. I had to.
Look, I have a lot to say, as most people know. You could all follow my YouTube channel because I have tens of followers.
That's it.
That include every cousin and aunt that I have, as well as my mother.
Right. And I follow Paul. He is very responsive. He loves it when you hit him up. So responsive.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm available for everybody.
Right.
Slide into his DMs. It's all good.
Slide in his DMs.
Gatherings, rallies, you got it.
Mm-hmm.
I will say that we do have some real important things coming up though, because we all get to vote in November, but this should be a call to action to inform and educate ourselves as to what is on the ballot from the very bottom of the ticket to the very top. I will ask my dog catcher, what do you think about Black Lives Matter, dog catcher? What do you think about justice reform? Because that's the kind of voter I am. I just want to know. And I will say, not as a plug, but just by way of background, I was I was Kamala Harris's chief of her administration when she was here. And her knowledge, understanding, and breadth of approach to many of these issues that we've been talking about, specifically in the criminal justice reform process, is so deeply informed. Those are some of the things that I like to look for and ask about from candidates. And I'm not mandating that they all know, but I want to know, what do they know? And if they care about these things, because those are the things, back to Melba's point, that are important to me. Because I do place those Google alerts on things. And my Google alert notification is, I might as well just read the paper every day, because the articles and stuff that come in every day, because I care about a lot of things. I am intellectually curious, and I have strong opinions about a whole lot that I am ready to talk about. So I just like to know those things. But I do the same things with the elected officials that I support and the elected officials that are running for different offices. And I think that it's fair to ask those kind of questions from our mayor, just as it's fair to ask those questions of our chief of police, as it's fair to run for who, I'm that guy that is at the homeowners association wants to know, well, what is your opinion about the economy right now? Because I have my own opinion, but I want to know what you think if I'm going to be trusting you with my vote for leadership around here on this block. I'm just that kind of guy. And I encourage other people to do those kinds of things as well, because the more informed you are, the better your decisions can be. And again, we can't fix what we don't talk about. So don't complain, vote. Don't cry about it, activate about it. So anyway, all right, that was it.
I like that.
I appreciate you all for such a rich and thorough conversation. I know we're approaching the 90-minute mark. And I just wanted to offer some notes of gratitude. One, to the tireless staff of the ABA itself. Tracy Kampf is our point person, and she always does such a wonderful job of putting these webinars together and facilitating them. And then to the leaders of the ABA Young Lawyers Division, pardon me, folks like Tamara Nash and Michael Long Nguyen, who was very instrumental in putting this together and getting our panelists for this discussion, to Lauren for her excellent co-moderation and just thoughtfulness in all of these issues, and being such an activated member of the YLD. Lauren, did you have any remarks you wanted to share?
I just wanted to say thank you for all of this rich information, because little do you all know, y'all have educated me in a lot of things. I'm just sitting here eating it all up like, yes, this is amazing. So I just want to say thank you. And of course to Andrew, you were fantastic.
Thank you so
Did an amazing job.
Thank
See,
you.
we earned our money today.
There you go. There we go.
These tens of thousands of dollars.
What's going on? I know.
For folks following, I'm sure a lot of folks saw this on Facebook Live, but follow the ABA Young Lawyers Division on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. We'll follow up with some resources. We had some good questions, but the time just kind of got away from us. Things ranging from police unions to how policing looks in other communities across the country. And I'll aim to compile some resources and put them together in the email blast, perhaps it goes out after this. But thank y'all so much to Paul, Melba, Chris, Lauren, Tracy,
Thank you.
Michael, Tamara. So thankful for everybody's hard work on this. It's been wonderful.
Yes.
Hey, it's been great. Thank you.
Tracy, y'all are amazing.